Welcome to the Tank Magazine podcast. I'm Guy McKinnon-Little. In this episode, I'm joined by writer and archivist Che Gossett to discuss the politics and poetics of abolition. Gossett is a PhD candidate at Rutgers University and the 2019-20 Helena Rubinstein Fellow in Critical Studies in the Whitney Independent Study Program. They've written extensively on queer, trans, and black radicalism, resistance, and abolition. We're speaking on the occasion of the programme Revolution is Not a One-Time Event, organised by Gossett alongside Lola, Olufemi and Shin, and which takes the form of a series of events airing every Monday in August, in which activists, academics and artists reflect on abolitionist praxis and thought. So it's a somewhat obvious question maybe, but also a question which I feel is perhaps necessary to address given the kind of if you sort of compare like the very long history of kind of thinking and practice that the idea of abolition emerges from versus the very sort of tight window with which this term has entered the political mainstream, I think it would just be really good to start off to just sort of hear in the kind of broadest possible terms. And I imagine this is a question which is difficult to ever answer fully or give one answer to. But it'd just be really great to hear, like, what is your kind of understanding of the idea of abolition?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think of abolition as what Mariam Cabo calls a horizon, kind of a possibility. And I guess my own genealogy of abolition, I think it has multiple origin points. The first would be the ongoing Black freedom struggle. So thinking about abolitionist movement during pre-1865 emancipation, so-called proclamation, and the work of Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass and many, many other Black freedom fighters. And those are the people whose names we know and whose work we know. And that doesn't include all the other countless activists and rebellions and forms of rebellion that are like quantifiable and unquantifiable according to the coordinates of history. So I think of abolition as an unfinished struggle for collective liberation that is open-ended and kind of like an invitation that is irreducible to like one figure, but it represents an ongoing struggle against anti-Blackness, anti-queer, anti-trans, white heteropatriarchal, and racial capitalist state power. And another kind of node in this genealogy would be the work of Critical Resistance, which is a prison abolitionist organization that many of its foremost thinkers and activists have been hugely influential to contributing to a kind of almost like a theoretical and activist formation, or that's what it is, around what abolition means and how it might be enacted and how it is ongoing and what's happening on the ground, and also emboldening it as a political imaginary. So that would be the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is such a incredible abolitionist thinker, and who, in her work Golden Gulag, in her work Abolition, Geography, and the Problem of Innocence, and that's in a text called Futures of Black Radicalism that came out from Verso, I think 2 years ago maybe. And, her countless lectures and talks, and interpersonally too. I and so many other people have learned about abolition as an analytic and what she calls non-reformist reforms, and thinking about abolitionist struggle and as a form of analysis. And also, of course, Angela Davis in her work, Are Prisons Obsolete?, and her long history of scholarship and activism. So there's an ensemble of abolitionist thinkers and activists who have shaped the understanding of what abolition is and what it can be. And I would also think of Eric Stanley and my sibling Tourmaline and trans and queer abolitionist political thinkers and activists and organizers, and also sex worker activists and organizers. And so abolition as a horizon continues to expand. And I think that's what's so powerful about it as an analytic, as a tool, is that it keeps getting strengthened and keeps getting bigger. It's more expansive, and because we need, the most expansive horizons and imaginaries and tools to really struggle against the kind of apparatus of the carceral, racial, capitalist carceral state. But also at the same time, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition and presence. She thinks about abolition, she says, not so much as absence, but as presence, which is a really powerful way of thinking about how abolition is imminent to movements that we're already taking part of, to our interpersonal relations. And so abolition is not something as a kind of like just to come, but also as already here. And I think that's really radical, especially in the sense of thinking about abolitionists, thinking about radical movements and the ways in which often there's a ready-made political schema that's about the revolutionary movement. And often that involves a vanguard that will take state power. And those have been powerful, of course. But this is thinking about abolition and revolutionary movement in a way that feels unprecedented in terms of the multiplicity of strategies that can happen, and how to both build on other revolutionary formations as a continuum, but also thinking about what are the ways that we can continue to learn, adapt, and in our own moment, in the present tense, continue to kind of reform and reshape this current radical and revolutionary movement.
What I really appreciated about your answer is the way, rather than looking for a kind of like definition based on the contents of this term, you frame it as an analytic or an orientation, and then just sort of look at the ways and the huge cast of people who have been putting this orientation analytic into practice. And I also really like the way that the idea of a horizon sits with that, because a horizon is something which sort of offers some source of orientation in the present, but it also is never something that you kind of arrive at. There's no sort of final solution. You sort of move towards it and it moves further away, even as it guides your movement. And I think that's maybe one way of thinking about the difference between abolition and kind of carceral frameworks of justice, which is probably a term we should define at some point, if you wouldn't mind doing that also, perhaps. So yeah, it would be really good if you could sort of talk about a bit more perhaps about what that kind of guiding analytic or the horizon of abolition kind of consists in, and how that differs from existing carceral frameworks of justice.
Yeah, so I think, there's a ready-made and pre-given, pre-established carceral grammar of justice, right? And carceral grammar of safety. And those two are embedded, sedimented in our society, and really sedimented in our kind of psyche and collective political consciousness. So they can be really difficult to think outside of. However, though, I think that going back to that kind of the multiple critical genealogy of abolition, people who have been, and groups who have been outside of the law and against the law, the enslaved Black radicals, group shaping abolition, have such an analysis of how the law and the carceral both operate as forms of capture, ontological capture and material capture. And so, the state kind of sets up typologies of worth that operate in a way that is really binarized and that views some life as livable, worthy, just, innocent. And so that's like the life that should be preserved through violent measures. And then it creates these necropolitical, violent institutions to kill and to ensure that people's lives are taken in a continuum of brutal and horrific measures, from kidnapping to trafficking to, putting in cages to taking life that is the form of the death penalty. But all these forms are stealing away. Sandra Bland's mother called the police body snatchers. And I often think about that. And she called herself a body watcher. And I think, that is incredibly, terribly apt. And so trying to think about how is the carceral working to, as forms of domestic warfare, that we as Black people have and queer and trans Black people have such an intimate relationship with, from seeing our communities dealing with this. Black radical history is all about fugitivity and resisting and revolutionary responses to this violence. So it's refusing the terms of the kind of carceral modes of what justice looks like and thinking about other ways of relating. As Angela Davis says, prisons don't solve social problems, they disappear people. They disappear. And in the face of that subtraction, we're thinking about what are the ways that we can reformulate and rethink our ways of being together. So not only, and this is to go back to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, the part about presence. So it's not as simple, or it's not as one-dimensional as like the prisons will disappear. Of course, they need to, and they should, and they will. However, also it's about thinking abolition as a relationship and as a almost sociality. So thinking about, what are the ways in which the carceral isn't only enacted in the site of the prison and its political economy. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work has been to show how the prison became central to U.S. and also global political economy, but also, what are the ways in which we can unlearn carceral modalities in our own collective communities and relationships so that they don't get reproduced at that level as well.
Right. And I think what's so generative about that framing of abolition as a kind of life-making project as opposed to the sort of life-taking principle of carceral justice is that you can really zoom out with it, right? And kind of, apply that analytic to a whole bunch of different contexts. Like it's the prison, but it's also the planet, it's carbon capitalism, it's colonialism, where in all those cases, there's that kind of common underlying thing where care for some depends on making others disposable. And I think with that in mind, it would be really good to hear about sort of the ways in which you see an abolitionist framework being applied outside of that very immediate context of prison abolition, which is perhaps where it's kind of the primary sort of like thing that comes to people's mind when they imagine it.
Yeah. I think of, for example, like thinking about the carceral architecture of the gender binary, right, which is also an artifact of racial slavery and of colonialism in its early iteration, right? So thinking about, how the gender binary is part of the carceral continuum from the bathroom where trans people and non-binary people are kind of policed and attacked and arrested to the side of the prison, which is designed to eliminate trans life. And so that's another analytic, an abolitionist analytic, that trans abolitionist critique and activism has been central to kind of forging. And or I think about carceral feminism, which is a version of white feminism, right? So thinking about the kind of anti-sex, the pro-criminalization of sex work, and how sex worker activists are connecting decriminalization of sex work to abolitionist organizing, or that is a component of prison abolitionists and carceral abolitionists organized. And so I think that abolition as a horizon and as an analytic really helps us to think about, in the ways in which it's enhancing life and creating the affirmation of life against a system upon which life rests on a racial hierarchy of death it allows us to constantly think about what are the growing edges of that horizon itself. And so it's always an ongoing and imminent process and struggle. And so I think that's one of the most powerful pieces of it. Instead of a kind of totalizing vision of the to come, instead of that, it's like, how can we constantly make abolition, and how are we constantly enacting abolition in the present?
Sorry to interrupt. I'm Tina, Tank's full-time voiceover bot. I want to tell you about Tank TV, our new film streaming service. Tank TV is the antidote to endlessly scrolling through tedious rubbish on Netflix. For just £3 a month, you will get access to a hand-picked selection of some of the most important films ever made, with one film added every week. To sign up now, head to www.tank.tv. Your first month is free and you can cancel at any time.
Yeah, and I think your mention of carceral feminism is also maybe a good chance to pivot to something else I kind of wanted to bring up, which is how even in ostensibly sort of liberatory movements, these tendencies do still reappear, this desire for a kind of, an easy distinction between friend and enemy, and the kind of catharsis of punishment. There's something that kind of makes carceral frameworks of justice really hard to shake. And it would be really interesting to hear from you, what is that? What is it that accounts for that kind of continuous buy-in?
Mm-hmm.
What's so sort of seductive about it almost?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have such authority, and also it's constantly evolving. I think that might be a kind of one of the more difficult components of it, is that, it's constantly absorbing opposition. So it's a continuum, a carceral continuum. There's the things that maybe are growing like in consensus against. So for example, like something like the death penalty, there might be finally a consensus that this should kind of like be abolished and no longer exist. And that took a lot of organizing and convincing, because of the ways that the carceral so saturates common sense, and the kind of carceral grammar of justice is so embedded. But also, the carceral continuum works, its morphology and its like strategies work to absorb opposition, and carceral feminism is like an example of this. So I think that there's a way that like the carceral can work in tandem with a kind of like liberal politics of representation and racial liberalism. Before this moment of abolition breaking into the kind of public sphere in a way where it is kind of getting a hearing in the court of mainstream media, for example. Before this moment, there was this kind of crisis of legitimacy of the prison, where it was about like quote unquote mass incarceration, and there was this like bipartisan working together across the aisle, Republican Democrat idea, and the problem with this was like mass incarceration implies that grammar implies like an acceptable number, like the cages are acceptable, but when it gets too many or too big or too unwieldy, that it has to be managed. Interventions have to be made. And so what the kind of carceral liberal and carceral feminist approach to that would be reducing the kind of most egregious things that are happening to the most quote unquote innocent. So it's still keeping this binary. But the thing about it is that the prison, that's part of the logic of the carceral, where it allows the expansion of its capacity through the figure of the most criminal, the most unredeemable. And because that's where it often, becomes almost like a laboratory to expand its own powers and capacities. So we see this in things like the figure of the sex offender, for example. And so that as a category has allowed for things like civil confinement, which is putting people in psych wards post incarceration indefinitely, or it's there's a lot of scholarship on this now about the figure of the sex offender and how the prison becomes kind of the site of justice for sexual violence, except the problem is that the prison itself is the greatest site of sexual violence that is so naturalized. And so abolition asks us to not take a kind of atomized sense of justice that's predicated on these kind of like binaries of people who can be redeemed and non-redeemable people, which is just a logic of disposability, but instead to radically interrogate and radically reformulate the very concepts of justice at the micro and the macro. Because, just so much of the violence that's carried out in the name of the carceral, like, works according to ideas of justice. So this is like an intervention into that.
And then what does that kind of like interrogation or intervention sort of like look like on the ground right now? You know, like what are the ways in which abolition exists not only as a sort of idea, but as something that's kind of being, put into practice or enacted in the present?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's happening in such a dynamic way all the time, and especially right now. So from abolitionist calls to defund the police, for example, that's attached to a broader abolitionist horizon. And so thinking about, how are police budgets tied to the operations of racial capitalism. So for example, the lawsuits that get paid out by municipalities every year to settle the kind of police violence settlements, basically police brutality bonds, they're called, are often taken care of by firms and banks that were part of the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. So thinking about how these things are connected, in that case, in a loop of kind of racial carceral capitalism. So how something like the call to defund the police as part of that broader abolitionist demand and also like organizing. So it's never just one single intervention, but there's a kind of ensemble of interventions happening at the same time, is part of a broader analytic about like taking away power from the police and putting it back, or resources, and getting them for communities. And so I think that's been really important in terms of helping people think about the kind of massive amounts of resources the policing gets. Also, their campaigns for no new jails that have been happening for many years in places like Los Angeles to New York City, and also something that happens all the time in terms of local collectives is corresponding with people in prison, campaigns to get people out of prison. So I think there's kind of a lot of entry points into abolitionist work, and that never is static. And so I guess that's what I would say in terms of like to go back to the kind of invitational feel and nature of abolition.
And then as a kind of foil to that question, I'd also really love to hear about the ways you understand things like speculation and imagination functioning as kind of abolitionist tools in a way, because as I was saying earlier, I think a lot of what accounts for the kind of persistence of carceral thinking in many people's common sense is this kind of like phobic response to the unknown or the other or the ambiguous, where the fantasies of safety and security promised by things like prisons kind of provide a very convenient solution. And that's kind of a failure of imagination, which obviously, things like speculation can really intervene in terms of mapping kind of other possible futures, which is the other thing that you hear people say. They say, okay, like, what does this world without prisons or police look like? Like, how do you begin to conceptualize that? So with all that in mind, yeah, I'd really love to hear how you think about kind of speculation as a kind of essential component of a sort of abolitionist project.
Yeah, totally. And also just to go back to the beginning of what you were saying about this kind of phobic responses, abolition helps to understand the ways in which, fear has been operationalized, the object of that fear, right? That fear has been anti-Black, right? Like, so anti-trans, anti-queer. fear is weaponized through whiteness, through gender normativity, through white supremacy, through anti-blackness, as ways to justify killing and death and the racial state. So I think that abolition, it's not only kind of imagining alternatives to these kind of like forms of violence, but also understanding what these structures are doing. And yeah, I think that the speculative work of abolition as an imaginary is really powerful. And I think of, well, to kind of go back to the revolution is not a one-time event, and the kind of panel series, I think abolition and kind of art and aesthetics as a register through which abolition is being figured and thought through is really powerful. So I think of the work of like American artists and also tourmaline in terms of visual art and cinema. Also, however, in terms of abolition and Black studies and the work of Hortense Spillers, the work of Saidiya Hartman. In Saidiya Hartman's first book, Scenes of Subjection, she deconstructs the way in which the political subject, is grounded on the figure of the slave. In Sylvia Wynter's work, she critiques what she calls the genre of man as a genre, or the genre of man. And in Hortense Spiller's work, she writes about ungendering and racial slavery. And so thinking about how part of this speculative work of abolition, it happens on so many registers, and part of this panel series is a way to bring them into conversation with each other. So, when I think of speculation and abolition, the possibility to imagine a world without prisons and without what Hortense Spillers calls the grammars of capture, which I think is such a powerful phrase, is, there's so many people creating the conditions for that possibility. And the work of Hortense Spillers and Saidiya Hartman help us, and of course, Sylvia Wynter and Black feminist scholars really allow us to like deconstruct the current forms that feel so embedded and so naturalized. And instead we can recognize through this work, like how these are in of themselves constructed. And so that very interrogation and dismantling of something like the genre of the genre of man, of the modern political subject, and of the gender binary as a racial colonial technology, that breaking of those apart is part of the process of speculating beyond them. And so that's why I think this kind of work is so powerful. I was thinking about the work of tourmaline in her film Happy Birthday Marsha, and she has another film about a kind of imaginative, radical, speculative restaging of the life of Mary Jones, who was a Black trans sex worker, and kind of about fugitivity. And so thinking about, that archive and how, Marsha P. Johnson and the work of STAR, for example, the street transvestite action revolutionaries in the 70s, was speculative and collective forms of imagining and trying to enact at the level of social experimentation, like getting a house together and trying to have a kind of temporary fabulous / autonomous zone, and also organizing, to push against prisons and policing in general, and in queer and trans politics at that time. And these kind of politics of queer and trans liberatory horizons, Marsha P. Johnson, figures like that have been central to thinking about these as abolitionists. And so thinking about how reality without the violence of the gender binary is by necessity a reality without the violence of police and policing.
Fantastic, yeah. And then speculation is, of course, something which comes up in the really brilliant event series. You've co-organized Revolution is Not a One-Time Event. And so just to kind of round up our conversation and maybe kind of offer a kind of new pathway or a kind of a new point of departure for listeners who have made it this far. Do you maybe just want to say a bit about like, what's all going on there and kind of introduce the program a bit?
Yeah, sure. I'm so excited about this, and it's been such an honor to organize this with Sarah and Lola, and with Silver Press, and with Arika's support and sponsorship. And so it's a series of events every Monday in August, and also part of the inspiration is Black August, which is connected to the legacy of George L. Jackson, who was a Black radical thinker, incarcerated and killed on the inside, and his writing still reverberate, especially right now, especially around fascism, actually. And so there's every Monday in August, it's at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 11 a.m. Pacific, and 7 p.m. BST. So the first is the 3rd of August. It's called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, Abolitionist Feminist Futures. And the first part of this is from Audre Lorde's thought, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And it's Gail Lewis, Miss Major, Zoe Samundi, Hortense Spillers, and it's chaired by Akuwo Emejulu. And it's thinking through the politics of abolition and feminism, and how feminism has been part of the carceral feminism, white feminism, part of the Master's House and the Master's Tools. And so how is this being reimagined, interrogated, broken apart, reinvented, and the roles of Black trans and Black feminist and all the kind of collective power of that in our current moment. And so it's these thinkers and scholars and activists and artists coming together to think through abolition. So the second event is called Poetry is Not a Luxury, The Poetics of Abolition. And that's with Sadiya Hartman, Khadija Lubrin, Nat Rana, Christina Sharp, and it's chaired by Nadia Swabi. The next is August 17th, and it's called System Errors, Abolitionist Technologies and Aesthetics. And that's with American artist Danielle Brathwaite Shirley, Sandra Perry, and it's chaired by Legacy Russell. And that's bringing artists together to think about abolition and technology and aesthetics. And there's a profound quote from Sadiya Hartman that I come back to often that says that slavery is not only a social problem, but an aesthetic problem. And that has been something that I constantly think about. And so this is kind of a, one way of thinking through that question, and about art and in the afterlife of slavery, and about technology. How is abolition an aesthetic issue? And the prior panel is up about the poetics of abolition. The final one is on the 24th of August, and it's titled Happy Birthday, Marsha, and Tourmaline is showing her film, Happy Birthday, Marsha, and there's a conversation and a reading. Some of these involve readings or even music. And so that's with Adrienne Marie Brown, Black Obsidian Sound System in Tourmaline, and it's chaired by Lola Olufemi. And one of the aims of this was to think abolition in many different kind of registers, so including art and including poetry. And so to me, that's one of the aims, is to think about, how is abolition an aesthetic, poetic, and how are people across, so-called disciplines or genres or practices, really, actually, approaching abolition, and how are these practices in conversation, and how can they be co-enriched, and especially in this moment, how can the practice of abolition across these kind of modalities further the collective project of abolition as a horizon.
Wonderful. I'm so looking forward to tuning in. And yeah, thanks so much for talking. It's been such a pleasure to have you in conversation.
This has been great. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.